Hello, and welcome to the National Secular Society member briefing. This briefing is entitled Persistent Principles and is about the constant themes in secularist history from Victorian times to the present. Now, my name is Helen Nicholls. I'm Head of Operations at the NSS, and I'm joined by Bob Forder, who is part of the NSS Council and is also the NSS historian. And we're going to be discussing how many of the same themes have continued across our history, which spans 160 years. So, before we start, I'm just going to go through a few housekeeping points. Bob and I will have about half an hour's conversation, and then we'll open up to Q&A. So, if you'd like to ask a question, please put something in the Q&A box. I'll try to get through as many as possible. And I'd just make a request that if you are thinking of asking a question, please, if you can make them as succinct and clear as possible, because I have to read them out, and I'm more likely to do it if I can see what it's clearly about. Okay, so with all of that, Bob, we'll start with a basic question. Why has the NSS survived as long as it has?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've got four reasons for you. One negative, so I'll get that one out the way straight away. And that is that there is still religious privilege in society.
Yep.
So the reason the NSS was founded essentially is still there. I think progress has been made, but we're still battling away. But there are some more positive reasons as well. I think there have been some remarkably able people associated with the NSS over the years. We had these extraordinary first three presidents, Charles Bradlaugh, George William Foote, and Chapman Cohen, who headed up the organisation for some 80 years, which isn't bad going. And of course, Foote and Cohen also edited the Freethinker for 70 years, which was the voice of the NSS. More recently, there have been others as well. There have been people like David Tribe, Bill McElroy, Barbara Smoker, Jim Herrick, Nick Walter, all of whom have given large parts of their lives to the organisation. And today, I think that's carried on, actually. I think we've got a powerful team today who are carrying the name of the NSS forward.
That's good.
Second, a third reason, really, I think the world has changed since 1866, you might have noticed, but the NSS has managed to adapt and evolve as well. That hasn't always been a smooth process. And on a couple of occasions over the period of its existence, it's been frankly close to collapse. Most recently in the mid 1990s, when the then General Secretary, Keith Porteous-Wood, now President, I think really rescued the organisation from oblivion.
Mm.
And lastly, and strangely, I think the NSS has actually benefited from the fact that secularism is an ambiguous term, which has evolved and changed in its meaning over the period the NSS has been in existence. You said 160 years earlier, Helen. It's a little bit longer than that, actually. It's coming up to, now, have I got this right? 1880, no, 100, no, you're right, 160.
No, we've made a note, Bob, that it's the anniversary of the NSS this year. We pay attention. We know our birthday in
Ah,
September.
right, I'm sorry about that one. That's my first slap wrist of the evening, I can see. So that's my opinion as to why we've survived and lasted so long. And then just add to that, actually, one other thing. I think we are the oldest radical campaigning organisation extant in the UK, which is pretty good.
Okay, so obviously one campaign that has been key in British secularism and remains so today is one of the very core ones, which is the disestablishment of the Church of England. How's that campaign changed over the years?
Well, yeah, well, first and foremost, I think the Church of England was the enemy in 1866. That's the way I think that most people who joined the NSS in those years perceived it. Now, Helen, can you manage to get up that image from my prayer book?
Yes,
My
your
book of
every
common
good
prayer.
secularist has a prayer book.
Yes, here it is. It's rather a nice copy from 1692. I recently had it rebound so I can consult it regularly. Now, there's a lovely woodcut there. King Charles II, his return, it says at the top. And accompanying it over on the other side is a prayer. Just worth looking at the first two lines there. Form of prayer with thanksgiving to Almighty God for having put an end to the great rebellion by the restitution of the king and royal family. Now that all says a lot to me. The church, the monarchy, the aristocracy, the establishment were one and the same in the 19th century. In many ways, the Church of England was the thought police of the establishment. And that's the way that Bradlaugh looked at it. I think some people misunderstand Bradlaugh. They think of Bradlaugh being first and foremost an atheist. Well, he was an atheist, of course, but he was an atheist for a reason. He thought that the Church of England underpinned privilege in our society, and it was his belief that to improve the lot of the poor, the downtrodden, then the first thing you had to do was to weaken the grip of the church. Now that's changed, of course, because the Church of England no longer has the membership, it no longer has the influence, it no longer has the position really in our society. And there are many other religious denominations, sects, whatever you want to call them, that pervade our society. But I believe they still have a real privilege in our society, which is underpinned in all sorts of ways. So the role of the National Secular Society has become much more complicated. There isn't one enemy, or if there is an enemy, which is religion, the privileged position of religion. Perhaps I should correct it to say that. The privileged position of religion, that is much more diverse and it's much more complicated to deal with. And it doesn't just represent the privileged, the powerful in society. Sometimes quite the opposite, in fact. It represents the groups who are relatively underprivileged.
Okay, so in the 19th century, NSS president and Charles Bradlaugh, along with the vice president Annie Besant, were prosecuted for publishing contraceptive pamphlets. And it's interesting that campaigns for reproductive rights have persisted right through to the present. Why do you think this is?
Yeah, right. Well, well, actually, a former president of the National Secular Society, the rather extraordinary in some ways, Barbara Smoker, said that the NSS's championing of birth control was its single greatest policy success. I heard her say it, and it was certainly significant. The most important event here was the 1877 republication of a little pamphlet by an American doctor called Charles Knowlton, and it was called Fruits of Philosophy. It was rather a strange title for a book or a pamphlet that devoted part of the space in it to telling you how to avoid conception, how to actually prevent conception. Incidentally, you might be interested to hear that the Knowlton, like others, didn't really so much recommend the condom, because they at the time were made of rubber and rather smelly and unpleasant. But he was more an advocate of using the sponge as the main way of avoiding conception, which also had the advantage in his view, and this is an interesting one, of giving the woman control, because, you know, there's been an element of feminism always there within the National Secular Society. I thought I'd just drop that one in. Right.
Mm.
So,
Well, I think a lot of what they recommended in those days would be firmly in the "don't try this at home" category these days.
well, I wasn't necessarily
Don't
recommending,
worry, I don't
but
think our members are that that easily suggestible.
yes, well, perhaps if we got another opportunity, I've got a wonderful set of sketches actually of various contraceptive devices to
Wow,
entertain people with if they're interested in the future,
that
because
that
many of these pamphlets included advertisements which were, I think, actually more explanatory than the text. But look, the point is, and I haven't got there yet. The point is that that people involved with the National Secular Society, who regarded themselves as free thinkers, thought that it was up to the individual to control their own fertility, not to religious authorities, not for religious authorities to tell them whether they should use contraceptive devices or not. And that's the key one. And in fact, I think the National Secular Society has always championed bodily autonomy in all its various forms. Yeah.
hmm Okay, and so we move on to another area of campaign that's been very, very relevant lately, which is, of course, freedom of expression. So, um, obviously, the G.W. Foote, the NSS president, was convicted and sentenced to prison for publishing blasphemous cartoons, and we still campaign today for the right to publish blasphemous cartoons. So, has anything really changed?
Yeah. I don't think it has at all. Um, just to give a bit of background on that one, Foote, who founded the Freethinker, which, as I said earlier, was associated with the NSS, and still is associated with the NSS to some extent. Uh, and I've got to give a little plug to the Freethinker, haven't I? Foote founded the Freethinker. He founded the Freethinker in 1881 when he was absolutely appalled by Bradlaugh's treatment uh, in attempting to take his seat in the House of Commons. And he decided that he wanted to take the fight to the Christians as he saw it. And so he founded the Freethinker, and the early copies of the Freethinker comprised cartoons or included cartoons. Now we've got one there somewhere, Helen, if you'd like to just pop that up.
Yes, we are going to have a blasphemous cartoon.
Here comes a blasphemous cartoon.
Okay.
Where is it? There it is. Moses getting a back view. Yes. I must say, I've got a collection of early freethinkers and they're full of cartoons. I don't actually find many of them very funny. I must lack a sense of
Well, I
humour.
mean, Travis, you do need to know your Bible. So I might just to give everyone some context. This is a scene in the book of Exodus where
Yes.
Moses is given the privilege that God puts him onto a ledge and walks past him, and it's implied God's to him. You know, Moses can't just look on God's face or whatever because that's too much. But he's given the privilege of being allowed to see God from the back. And Foote has rendered this in a possibly rather irreverent manner.
Well, certainly some people didn't like it.
It's in the Bible.
They got very hot under the collar about it. And it is interesting that it is cartoons more than the written word that seems to have this effect on the religious. And I think Foote actually said, he wrote very well, Foote, and he often put his finger on a point. He said that he thought that once a religion had been laughed at, no one could ever really take it seriously again. And this was what guided him, if you like. The other thing that guided him is that he was actually inviting martyrdom. He actually seemed to sort of say, "Come and get me," you know. And they came along and got him, and they tried him, and he ended up in Holloway jail for a year. At that time, it wasn't a women's prison; it was a more general. It was, I think, a men's prison actually. And so that was really what went on here. Foote benefited it from it in some way. He had a pretty miserable year. But on the other hand, when he came out, he was something of a free thought champion. And so a few years later, when Bradlaugh died and Annie Besant had quit the scene, it was Foote who became president, which obviously I think was something that he actually had aspired to and aspired to in a big way. Now, coming to the present, the same thing's going on, isn't it? I'm very conscious of the Charlie Hebdo attacks of 2011, 2015, 2020. And in the second of those attacks, 12 people were actually killed. And in this country, on the 25th of March 2021, a teacher was suspended after a cartoon of Mohammed was shown in class during a discussion about press freedom and religious extremism. And this sparked protests, as I expect many of our listeners are aware, and it actually involved disciplinary action against the teacher, which was eventually dropped. But I'm afraid the sting in the tail is that that teacher has still never returned to work, despite the fact he was formally reinstated, has been forced to move and is now living somewhere else under a new identity. So some things never change. And perhaps they get worse, because what disturbs me, and it disturbs me in a big way, is that, Bradlaugh, Annie Besant, G.W. Foote, they were notorious in their time and they were hated and loathed by a section of the population. But nobody ever tried to kill them.
Yes, and obviously it's notable now. Someone like Foote probably wouldn't face any criminal punishment. I mean, obviously we have had cases of people facing criminal punishment over offence to religion, as we saw recently with the Hammock Hoskin case. But it generally takes something a bit more than a cartoon to trigger actual action by the state.
Yes. Yes, yeah, I suppose, and of course the NSS was very much in the forefront in having the blasphemy law removed from the statute. How many years ago, Helen? Do you know? I don't.
I think it was in 2008.
Okay, okay, and the NSS was very much part of that campaign, of course. Yeah.
Okay, so um, over the years, has the NSS's style of campaigning remained consistent?
No, not at all. uh, right. Okay. How do we put this? Right. I think that this is a very, very, very broad generalization, and you probably going to make holes in it in a moment. But I think there have been three phases. Okay. Phase one was the Bradlaugh era, 1866 to 1990. During that period, the NSS took on some of the characteristics of a political party, with a wide range of policies, including things like republicanism, land law reform, extension of the franchise, promotion of birth control, neo-Malthusianism, as it was called at the time, we've already talked about to some extent. It had a wide range of policy positions. And then Bradlaugh died, and things changed. For a start, the Independent Labour Party began to emerge, and many of the former working class supporters of the National Secular Society thought perhaps the individualism which the NSS represented was less effective than the collectivism which the socialists began to pioneer. And so there's a change. And Foote himself, when he became president in 1890, he said that the heroic period of the NSS was over and it was going to be a rather different organisation. And so it was. And so for his presidency, and I think for Chapman Cohen's as well, which takes us right up to the 1950s, the NSS evolved in being more a trade union, more inward looking, and a trade union for unbelievers, which is essentially what it was till fairly recently. That's an oversimplification. I know it's an oversimplification. In the 1960s, for example, there was a period of, particularly under David Tribe's presidency, there was a period when the NSS really did try to influence government policy and became more outward looking. But that was a relatively brief period. When we go back to Chapman Cohen, he was the longest serving president of the National Secular Society. He was once criticised in an annual conference. It said, why didn't he go out and talk to MPs and network with MPs? And he replied by saying, believe it or not, he said, well, if they want to talk to me, they can come to me.
Yeah, that's not an approach we take to campaigning.
Exactly. So phase 3 is since not the mid-1990s, when the NSS has metamorphosed, I think, into a campaigning pressure group. Right, of course its members are important, of course it's a membership body, but it looks outward and it tries to focus on influencing government policy and trying to get laws changed and policies changed, which I'd like to think we have some success with.
Yes, we definitely do. So, and one thing you mentioned, well, once was about the practice of, sort of what you called constitutionalism. When we
Yes,
discussed this
yes,
before, that we've always been fixed on changing the law through the system.
absolutely. And this was Bradlaugh, wasn't it? Bradlaugh set this in motion. Before that, secularist freethinkers hadn't always thought the best way forward was through Parliament and all that sort of thing, the constitutional ways. I mean, Richard Carlile, who in some ways was a predecessor of the NSS, he actually thought that working people should be prepared to arm themselves. And he wasn't quite a revolutionary, I wouldn't say, but he wasn't against a bit of insurrection, should we put it that. He was influenced by things like Peterloo, of course, because we're going back to the earlier years of the 19th century. But constitutionalism, yeah, and Bradlaugh got criticised for this. His view always was that Parliament could be reformed and that Parliament could reform. And that was the way of doing things. And as a man who dominated for a period, and a critical period at the end of the 19th century, who dominated radicalism, was the leader of radicalism, I think he had a big impact on setting the tone for others who are interested in reform afterwards.
Okay. Okay, so we're almost coming up to the end of the first part. If anyone else has questions, by the way, we don't have that many in the Q&A. Normally we've got quite a few by this point. So if anyone's got a question you'd like to ask, please write it in the box. And meanwhile, we'll just have one more question. So the NSS used to be an explicitly atheist organisation, and we've moved to focus on secularism, the separation of religion and state. Rather than atheism. Do we retain any consistent principles in spite of this?
Oh yes, yes, we're essentially trying to resist religious privilege wherever it exists in the public square. The Americans use the expression the public square, don't they? So it's not just a matter of parliament. I could be a little argumentative about this because there is I think sometimes this idea that once the NSS was an atheist organisation and now it's a secularist organisation can be a bit of an oversimplification. It begins with a questioning, I think, about what the words mean, because the word atheism or atheist certainly means different things to different people. So do words like secularism. I think the NSS is very clear about what it means by secularism and has defined it, but I'm not sure everybody looks at it in quite the same way. And as time has gone on, as we said earlier, the word has changed in its meaning. And I do think that it's worth noting that certainly when Bradlaugh was around in the early years, and I know we're going back a long way, that his sort of NSS wasn't entirely exclusive as far as the religious were concerned. And I was thinking about this the other day. At his funeral, people like Gandhi turned up, David Lloyd George turned up. They supported many of his policies. The Reverend Stuart Headlam, who was quite an important and influential Christian socialist, was a great supporter of Bradlaugh and continued to support the NSS into the 20th century. And so, you know, one of the problems those of us who are secularists, free thinkers, whatever you want to call us, are the words, because the words often mean different things to different people.
Yeah, I mean that's true, but one really key thing at the moment is that now people can join the NSS who are religious but accept secularist principles, and we get ministers of religion from time to time. You get some interesting cases. It's still predominantly the non-religious who join us, but I think, we discussed before that there was an element of rationalism in secularism
Yes,
maintained.
I think there is. I'm not sure quite how to say that, but I think essentially most people who are secularists look at the world in fairly rational terms and try to work out the reasons for things and try to go on the evidence which is in front of their eyes. I mean, well, let's bring this right up to date. I'm absolutely terrified at the moment, Helen, about some of the things that
Okay.
Mr. Hegseth are saying, where we seem to be embarking on a crusade in the Middle East, or America does, but perhaps I'm getting a little bit off the topic here.
Okay. Well, yeah. Obviously, if we were on the subject of things in the news to be worried about, there'd be a lot of them. One thing I think probably on the rationalism thing is that people who are religious who embrace secularism, they've probably on some level decided that public policy needs to be based on reason and evidence and not
Hmm.
religious doctrine. Sometimes there's also a pragmatic element of simply not wanting another religious faction to have the upper hand, but there is a sort of sense that if you accept a kind of religiously neutral public sphere, that maybe that's how the state should operate, how you operate in your personal life, how you think, what people do in their spare time is a different matter, but you've sort of accepted that principle at least in relation to the civic.
Yeah, but I think I'll throw something else in here. I think it depends which religion, which denomination, which church you're a member of to some extent.
Hmm.
I think it's easier for some to become secularists than it is for others, depending on their particular brand of religion, if you like.
Yes, and the more hardline
Mm.
of most religions are less likely to accept it.
I
Although,
thought
of
I think
course,
it's that, sorry,
the more liberal of most religions often will embrace it to protect themselves from the hardliners.
that's right. And I think for for example, and it's not the only example I could take, Christian fundamentalists, I think will find it difficult to be a secularist. I'm not quite sure it's a contradiction in terms, but I think we're getting close to that.
Okay, so let's go to questions. So, um, the first question is um, from Veiled Rose, who wants to know, are we going to be having a birthday party for the NSS? I'll answer that. We have talked about doing something. I said it will be in September. We're actually having an events meeting tomorrow to discuss that kind of thing, and it's probably going to come up. So I'll mention that this has been spontaneously raised at the event. But yeah, it's something we're considering because it's a landmark year. She also wants to know, does the NSS have links with and networks within the trade union movement?
Can I just come in there before we go on to that one, Helen? I
Yeah.
think it's a jolly good idea to have an event, but then I always approve of events.
Oh, I knew you'd be all in favour of it, Bob.
Yes, yes, like an event.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I say we have a meeting to discuss events tomorrow. So hopefully, I can see there's been a wider question about events that, yes, we are hoping to hold a range of things. And we also do give talks to local groups as well. So local groups can request speakers from us. Okay, so we have next person is Diana, who wants to know, will the bishop's bench ever be abolished?
It's got to be, hasn't it? I mean, I think a poor old Bradlaugh, it must be turning in his grave over in Brookwood, mustn't he, at the moment? The thought that things still exist. It's absolutely extraordinary. Um, Surely somebody has to get to grips with the issue of constitutional reform. They have to get to grips with the whole issue of um, they have to get to grips with the whole issue of the House of Lords and its composition in general. And it's quite stunning that we haven't got there yet. Um, but when, I don't know. I mean, I'm fairly I'm fairly mature now. I'm in my 70s. But if you said to me when I was in my 20s, the bishop's bench would still be there, I would have been amazed. But it is. I just hope it's gone by the time my grandchildren grow up.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder what Bradlaugh would have thought of it still lasting this long. I think one thing that's really key at the moment is that the Labour Party are trying in the process of getting rid of the hereditary peers because
Yeah.
if you look, I mean, we do tend to do things very piecemeal in Britain. And if you look at sort of House of Lords reform, the most outrageous aspect is probably the hereditary peers for your average person. Once the hereditary peers are gone, the bishops are going to stand out a lot more.
I
As
think one of the problems is a lot of people don't even realise that they're bishops in the House of Lords, let alone there's so many of them.
well, no, I mean, and that really points to the fact that we don't have very good citizenship education. That people aren't often aren't very well informed about how the state works.
The reason I'm a member of the National Secular Society, and I think secularism is important, is in a sense, it's not secularism in its own right that I'm worried about. It's liberal democracy I'm concerned about. I mean, I think well, Churchill once said something about democracy being the least worst form of government, didn't he, or something? I
Mhm.
think liberal democracy, our our system of representative democracy, is better than any other I'm aware of. I mean, liberal democracies are not inclined to murder their citizens, for example, which I think is a reasonable position to take. So, so and I think secularism is one of the props of liberal democracy, as are free elections.
Yes.
Yeah, as and you could name a number of other features. And that at the end of the day, I mean, if you haven't got a secularist system, you haven't got a basic equality of rights between people. And liberal democracy depends on that.
Yeah, I mean it's a good point. And one thing I'm always aware of working in campaigning, I've done working campaigning on and off throughout my career, is that we do take for granted that this is just something you can do and you don't have to fear the government are going to come and have you killed. But in other countries, you meet people who are campaigners in other countries where that's a real and possible thing to happen.
Yes.
I've been in organisations where you have to consider whether your person working abroad is going to suffer that fate. It's a thing in a lot of countries. So
Well,
anyway, on that cheerful note, um, so David wants to know if Quakers claim to be religiously secular. I don't feel I'm an authority on Quakers. Do you have any knowledge of that, Bob?
not really, other than the fact that Quakers have often allied themselves with secularist causes, and it's pretty clear. I can't say I'm an expert on Quakerism, but Quakerism, as I understand it, leaves a lot of scope for the individual and individualist interpretations of what is right and wrong. And in that sense, I think that brings them close to secularism. Whether they recognize it in those terms, I don't know. Um, a good friend of mine who sadly died recently, Michael Bush, who was something of an expert on Thomas Paine. He always made the point, and I think really Paine, in many ways, you could say, was the founder of modern secularist ideas. He didn't use the word secularist, but he founded many of the ideas that secularism is based on. Um, Paine, of course, had a Quaker background, and Michael always argued that Quakerism greatly influenced his writings and his thoughts.
I mean, obviously, Quakers are very heavily associated with political reform movements as well in the 19th century. So um, you can see connections and where there would be alliances. So, got an anonymous question. Are there any notable changes to the NSS with the rise of different religions in the country?
Oh, yeah, I think there are. I think we alluded to some of that earlier. Um, and sometimes I think it's very difficult because the situation is becoming far more nuanced than it ever was before. Obviously, the increase in the number of Muslims in the country is a new issue that was never faced by the NSS in its early years. And sometimes I think this is quite difficult for us to um, counter or deal with or work ourselves around, because often we're dealing with people who have come from societies that do not have secularist ideas, haven't been brought up with secularist ideas in any shape or form. And I'm bound to say one of the things that troubles me is that the liberal left, if you like, or the centre liberal left, has so little to say on the subject, whereas the right wing have got an awful lot to say. And sometimes I think secularist causes, we're in danger of secularist causes becoming dog whistle issues for racism. How we confront that is difficult, and involves a lot of hand wringing and a lot of head scratching, I think. But I
I
think
mean,
it's very important that we do manage to keep a clear distinction between the two.
yeah, I mean, it's true. At least we do confront it, because obviously a lot of organisations have chosen to go very silent on a lot of very serious issues. But
Yeah.
it is more difficult. Obviously, it is in some ways more fun having when you're just having a go at the establishment.
Yes.
It is easier in a way, because we live in a country where the establishment won't come and kill you. It's kind of fun. Um, but it is a lot harder when the situation's more nuanced. Um, and then you sometimes have the mirror version. I see occasionally you get the mirror version on the political right where they don't want to have a go at the establishment. So people who will be outraged at something, if it relates to Islam particularly, will be completely not outraged by the exact same thing being done by Christians. You can sometimes see that dynamic happening.
Perhaps
Um,
it's sometimes more of a problem for people like me and my way of thinking of the NSS, which is an organisation that was founded and I feel still should be on the side of the underdog. And that's that's part of my perception. Perhaps it's one that's not shared with all members of the NSS, but that's the way I'm inclined to look at it.
I think it
And
might depend which underdog you have in mind.
yeah, yes, it does. Yeah.
Um, okay, so
But just to finish that point, it's often the underdogs that in our society seem to be the most fundamentalist in their religious beliefs.
sometimes, although one thing I think that gets overlooked in this is the minorities within minorities, that people within those groups often are silenced by the people who have the most power within the group. And it's especially true when, I mean, again, this happens again. I mean, this dynamic plays out in all groups, but in the case of radical Islam, we do see an ability to silence to silence dissenters with violence, and that's one key thing is that we don't usually see, say, liberal, wishy-washy Christians being terrified that fundamentalist Christians will kill them. We don't see liberal Jews being terrified of Hasidic Jews, but we do see with radical Islam a fear of violence that makes the campaigning a bit more difficult. Um, okay, so
Questions
okay,
appear now.
next question from Tony is that um, many of the NSS's excellent policies and campaigns, which are also supported by public opinion, seem to be placed in the too difficult box by government, often under the guise of lack of parliamentary time, but largely to pressure from religious lobbies. How can we overcome this?
Shout louder. Try to use all the techniques that we have always used in the past. Helen, I feel you know more about this than I do.
I mean, it depends what the issue is. I mean, I think possibly he's alluding to assisted dying, where I think the government's own position is a bit ambiguous because there are lots of reasons why these kind of things don't get done by governments. They get done by private members' bills, and but it complicates everything. So I mean, this is a case of a serious sort of constitutional muddle that sort of lays bare the whole difficulties in our constitutional arrangements in a way. And I don't know how it's going to play out, but we'll just have to see. Other issues you'd have to just take them as they come, because some of the issues are definitely in the too difficult box by the government. You have to accept they're a long game. I think certainly our campaigning on things like non-therapeutic circumcision is one we've sort of accepted is seen in that light at the moment. But everything was in the too difficult box once. It had some campaigns took decades, took centuries. If you think how long it took to have things like universal suffrage, some campaigning is very slow. Some things suddenly go from being not on the agenda to being on the agenda very quickly. I think our charities campaign has been a bit in that thing. When we started out, it was a very niche area of charity law that hardly anyone knew about, and now it's become one of our top campaigns.
I think the one thing worth mentioning, a couple of people on the questions are alluding to assisted dying. And if this bill does fall, despite the fact that the House of Commons voted in favour of it, and it's going to fall because it runs out of time in the House of Lords, I think that's going to raise some very difficult questions for the House of Lords as it's currently constituted, and and the and the powers that it has.
Oh, it will, and it will shine a lot of attention on the bishops as well. But I think, I mean, we're already seeing with the hereditary peers starting, we're already seeing a lot of moves towards House of Lords reform. It's the question of what form it takes, and of course, which party's in power at the next election will determine a lot what what type of constitutional reform we might get. Okay, so we've got Jalal wants to say that democracy can be criticised as relying on an appeal to the majority, a logical fallacy in which a proposition is assumed to be true or right simply because a majority of people support it. Do you have any comment on that, Bob?
Well, I suppose it is a logical fallacy, really, but it's better than it's better than having a system where one person, one oligarch, one Vladimir Putin decides what proposition is true or false. I think we've got a better chance of getting things right if more people are involved or majorities for it. It's not always going to work that way. And there's always going to be a danger that the wrong things are done despite the fact the majority of people are in favour of it. But I just think got a better chance of getting it right.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think I'd add to that is that obviously we're not a direct democracy. It's not, things aren't simply done by
Mm.
everyone in the entire country votes on every policy issue and the winner wins because we vote for representatives. They have to consider, they have to form governments, they have to sit and do all the very dull things that are involved in policy formation and take responsibility for things they support. So it's not, we don't have referendums very often in this country. It's not like every policy decision gets made simply on the back of what what the majority think, although obviously it does inform politicians when
Yes,
they make
it's
policy.
that's a very good point, Helen.
Okay, we've got a question about the push of um, certain groups who want to frame patriotism through a certain Christian nationalist lens in opposition to the felt societal imposition of other religions, particularly Islam. How can the NSS promote a healthy form of secular patriotism to counteract this? And how can it reach out to younger audiences more generally?
um, secular patriotism, right? I wouldn't have termed it quite that way myself. I would like to go back to my argument earlier that secularism is a cornerstone of liberal democracy. So I'm not sure I want, I'm looking for secular patriotism, but I'm looking for an understanding that secularism is this cornerstone of liberal democracy, which, as far as I'm concerned, is the best way of governing ourselves and protecting human rights and protecting the individual within society. I'm not
Yeah.
really against patriotism, but I'm not sure that's the way to frame the issue.
I mean, I think one thing with the Christian nationalism is that it's all. I mean, yeah, it is very concerning that certain groups are doing this. But one thing we've seen in Britain is the last census, less than 50% of the population described themselves on their census form as Christian. And bear on, we know from previous research data and from other forms of research like the social attitude survey that when people fill in the census, they're quite often reflecting their family background and not necessarily their personal beliefs. A lot of people who I know from some polling that a lot of people who in the past who've ticked Christian on the census don't believe in the physical resurrection of Christ, don't in fact believe in God. don't necessarily practice Christianity. So less than half the population now are describing themselves as Christian, and of the, I can't remember, 40 something or whatever the percentage that said they were Christian, a lot of those are not actually very religious. So to define, if you start defining patriotism and national identity in Christian terms, you're now, you're going to alienate most people now. Because we have a very significant part of the population are not religious. We have a significant number who are other religions, and also have a whole range of people who just don't like that attitude. I think a lot of Christians would say, well, I'm Christian, but I don't want to say that people who are not Christian aren't British. I don't think that's a view that all British Christians would endorse anyway.
Well,
So I think that they might, the people, I sincerely hope the people who do that will find it counterproductive.
there is another argument here that is sometimes troubling, is that everybody accepts that not everybody is a Christian in British society, but then the argument gets extended that it's a Christian society, a society whose institutions and culture was determined by Christianity. And I think that can be, that does fuel this Christian nationalist argument as well. And so I think we've got to be careful of that one.
Yeah, obviously this is a big thing for us at the moment, is keeping an eye on the rise of Christian nationalism,
Yeah,
because we've seen the effect obviously it's had in the USA.
yes. And is having big time at the moment.
Okay, just try to see who hasn't had a question yet, because we've had a few from the same people. I just want to. Chris from Atheism UK says hello. So it's not a question, but I'll say hello to Chris. So yes, Atheism UK are indeed an atheist group, for those interested. Okay, so I'm going to go through some of the other questions. Um, okay, so um, Rose says it's so frustrating that the workers' movement is so dismissive of Islamist extremism. As an ex-Muslim, I'm especially worried when the far right are rising and exploiting the fears of Islamism. I don't know if anything can be done about this.
What do we mean by the workers' movement? Do you know?
I think she asked a question earlier about the trade union movement.
Right. Uh, Dismissive, presumably by dismissive, she means they are ignoring Islamist extremism.
Yes,
I'm assuming that that's what she means.
yes.
Um, yeah, I'm worried about this as well. I think for many people, perhaps trade unions. I can't speak for trade unions, but perhaps it just falls into the too difficult box and potentially divisive box. Because after all, trade unions, like other political organizations, are trying to maximize their membership, and they don't want to alienate potential sections of it. What can be done about it? I suppose join the NSS is one answer, if that's not too glib.
Yeah, although I'm afraid, Bob, this is a member briefing, so you're preaching to the converted there.
Spread
Yeah.
the word. Spread the word then.
As for the
That's ultimately one of the reasons for having a membership, isn't it? Is to spread the word, because uh, it's inclined to be strong-minded people that join organisations. If you join the NSS, you feel strongly about something. Otherwise, you don't bother. And I think the more members we have, if we can maximise the membership, we maximise our influence, because the members influence others as well.
Mhm. Yes, and obviously when it comes to the twin issues of Islamism and the far right, who do feed each other to a very large degree, yeah, these are issues we're focused on, that we are very concerned about.
And they relish it, don't they? and they like the divisiveness.
Yeah, because
It
it's
fuels them.
yeah, and obviously if you can show if you're in either if you're in either camp, showing the threat from the other side is a way of gaining more support to your. I mean that's how you get polarization and extremes.
And that's why secularism is so important,
Yeah,
because the point is to take those divisions and those extremes to some extent neuter them within the context of liberal democracy.
hmm. Okay, David is saying, my view is that secularism is a social stance, separation of church and state, in contrast to atheism, which is a life stance related to belief.
Well, I would only qualify that by, well, I'll qualify that first of all by saying it's a political stance,
Mm.
secularism, rather than just a social stance, which I think broadens it out. In contrast to atheism, which is a life stance, depends what you mean by atheism, I think. Um, Atheism is, I think we've got one or two people from atheist organizations here, so I tremble when I try to define atheism here. But atheism, amongst many of the public, is regarded as a term which means denying the existence of God, denying the existence of supernatural. My understanding of atheism is not that, because that I think is a philosophically an illogical position to take, because you can't deny what you've never experienced. I think what you can say, which is what people like Bradlaugh, Foote, Cohen have all said, and philosophers like Bertrand Russell, is that atheism, the atheist position is that they have never experienced or have no knowledge of a God. They haven't seen a God. They haven't smelt a God. They haven't in any way sensed a God. Therefore, they act as if a God doesn't exist, which is a rather different position.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm not
obviously,
sure it's a life stance.
a lot of atheists have made the point that if you substitute God with fairies or whatever, and then say, well, do you have to conclusively prove their non-existence, which is impossible because it's proving a negative, to not believe in them? That's a fair point. A lot of atheist thinkers have meant. But yeah, I think we have certainly focused on the political separation of religion and state rather than theological arguments, because you do get drawn into eternal rabbit holes
Yes,
um, when you get in. I mean, it's quite enjoyable. I'm not saying that people shouldn't do it, and there are other outlets for it if that's what you want to do. But it can, if your goal is to bring about actual political change, it can be a massive distraction. The other thing is that you can also just lose allies who would support your political goals, but who don't agree with your
yes.
theological position.
I'm not. I wouldn't disagree with you, but just wondering. I don't know how old David Lord is, but
I try not to read out people's surnames because
oh,
he
I'm
doesn't
sorry.
mind.
Yes,
Okay.
okay, David. Yeah, I'm not sure how old David is, but I notice his use of the term life stance. Now, I can remember some years ago that Harry Stopes Rowe of what was then the British Humanist Association, he used to talk about a humanist life stance, right, which was a set of values which he thought all humanists should represent. Now, I don't think the NSS is in the business of life stances or a code of how people should live their lives. Um, so I think secularism is, in that sense, very different from any sort of life stance.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we don't go into all the wider sort of questions of that humanism would go into. And one thing we certainly find our membership, a lot of our members are definitely card carrying humanists or kind of inclined towards humanism to some extent. Some of our members are definitely not. There's a real mix in that. There's a different range of approaches. A lot of I think a lot of secularists are also very individualist and very definite that they kind of want to form their own views on things and don't want to sort of go into any sort of group way of thinking. So I mean, there's just a different approaches and different attitudes within it.
That David's revealed his age, Helen, and he definitely will remember Harry Stokes Rowe if he was interested in secularism
Mm-hmm.
over his lifetime.
Okay, so we're coming to an end now. So I'd like to thank everyone who's joined in to watch and everyone who's taken part. We hope to have our next member briefing in the near future. I've already started discussing that. As I mentioned, we'll be discussing events in the NSS office tomorrow. If anyone's got any topics they'd be interested in, always free to drop us an email as well, because we're considering possible topics both for member briefings, for events, online and in person. So we've got, hopefully we'll have a lot of good things coming up. So thank you very much, Bob, for
Can I say just something to finish off? Helen,
yeah.
that was really hard work.
Mm-hmm. What's really
That was
hard work?
it was really hard work.
What,
Yes,
this?
yes, yes. But I've got a headache, and
I'm sorry. I'm very sorry.
I'm
Sorry
going to
to have
have to
made you
go
suffer. You
away.
have to suffer for this cause, Bob.
Yes, I know,
DW
and I
Foot suffered
am.
in prison. You've suffered this.
I've martyred myself, and I'm going away to have a very large beer.
Okay, well, my husband is getting dinner ready. It's almost ready. I can smell it, so that's all nice. But yeah, thank you very much for that, Bob. It's been we appreciate it very much that you've done that. I also say thank you for my colleague Jack, who's been here doing the tech backup and answering questions as well. So thanks to Jack as well. And yeah, thank you to everyone who's attended,
Yes,
who's taken
thank
part,
you.
and hopefully we'll see you again at another member briefing. Bye.